Hello everybody. Today's project is a little bit of repair work on this 1863 Roby Sword. I had previously taken this guard off and started to anneal it, which is why it's discolored a little bit, and then I realized it might be fun to do a video. Did find a reference picture for what that guard should look like. As you can see, it's quite a bit different than what we have. I just reassembled this thing for the video very, very lightly, so I only just have to wipe the burr off of the end of this tang. But originally, of course, just file the tang knob off of there. I just file until I see a ring, a little light ring around the tang, and then I punch the rest through, and that way it doesn't damage the brass. So here's the assembly, the pommel, the grip. There's a little collar and then the D-guard itself. Looking to anneal this brass piece now, concentrating the heat on the boss in the center of the shell guard. That's what's going to take the most time to heat up. I'm aiming for a very even heat here. I could have thrown this in the forge, in a little gas forge, but this seemed like it would be just as easy. With non-ferrous metals like brass, you don't necessarily need a slow cool. The heating itself is what will do the annealing, and you could even quench it. Some people do quench it. Because this is darkened, going to be darkened, and I want to match as closely as I can the patina that exists, I didn't want to quench or pickle it. I wanted to leave the oxide in place. So rather than quench or pickle or any of that, I just heat it up and leave it. And while it's cooling, you can go have a look at the other parts. I just stuck this in here for reference. I thought it might be interesting for those who were looking to reproduce these things, or just wanted to have a little reference on how these early swords were put together. This is a nice little piece. Looks like it was cast and turned. The other piece looks like it was cast and turned. And then the little collar almost looks like it was wrapped around. You can just see a joint on the other side right there where my finger is, a little crack, a little seam. The tang is even bent. I'm not entirely sure how that happened. This thing really must have been smashed up pretty good somehow. You can see the original finish there. I'm not going to get back to the original finish because of the pitting. There's simply too much pitting. A case like this is always, a bit of a balancing act, because you don't want to destroy original material. I could go grind this all back beneath the pitting and repolish it, recut the hallmarks, the touch marks, but then then you have an all new piece. And so a lot of times with antiques, it's better just to not over clean them, just to leave them, leave them as they were. So I have this board with a little cleat on it. I throw that in my vise, and I use this for scraping knives, sanding, and cleaning up, hand saws, anything sort of thin and flexible that you want to support. And I just use that all-purpose, multi-purpose stick across the item with 2 C-clamps. You can also use an iron staple and a wedge, which is seen, like in Japan and other areas in Asia. You see that, like an iron staple with a wooden wedge. But I like leaving the table just empty. I find it's more flexible if I have just a plain flat table. So I just carve up various wooden forms that hold sandpaper, leather, buffing compound, in this case a little fine 4-0 steel wool. I'm just very, very lightly scuffing off the external rust and just kind of burnishing everything down. I'm not looking to remove it and get back to a clean surface. Pretty self-explanatory here. Just bend up a bar in the forge, stick it in the vise. You got yourself a bending fork. This sword was bent pretty severely and also twisted. There you can see I've gotten already quite a bit of the bend out, but not the twist. It still twists like a corkscrew. And it's pretty nerve-wracking. The problem is that it's been ground, and there are parts that are thinner than other parts. In that distal taper is not even, is what I'm trying to say. So it does not go evenly from thick to thin. There are little wasted sections, and those little wasted sections want to bend more easily. Tempers aren't always even, so sometimes areas will bend more just because the temper is a little drawn a little further. And they could just snap at any moment. So it's kind of nerve-wracking. I just take it easy, go slow, try and really feel for what's going on there. Here's a little mise-eye view. I just sight down. I try to decide, where the apex is, and then as I'm bending, I watch where it's actually bending, and then adjust in between the 2 forks or with the single fork. And that's really the only way to do it. With all the different, with unequal section and unequal temper and whatnot, you just kind of have to keep going. Just keep at it. This is my beater surface plate. I'll do light hammering and things on this plate, so it's not incredibly accurate, but it's perfectly accurate for something like this. It's perfectly adequate, I mean to say. It'll do just fine. Using that plate with a light source behind it just helps me easily identify the apex of the curve, and then I just mark it with a piece of soapstone so that when I get back over to the fork, I can really make sure it's bending at the apex of that curve. The tang is actually welded on to the sword with a forge weld. The last 3 or 4 inches or so of that tang are just iron, I presume. So I can straighten them with a hammer at the anvil, just cold. We're not talking about much. If it were severely bent, I would probably coat the blade in something to protect it, and like a heat sink, and then heat the tang. But it's not really bad. And here I'm just rolling and tapping the end to dress any burrs, and also to just stretch it lightly so that I can rivet it. Now I bring the annealed guard at this point. It is cooled. And so I take it over here to my simple tree-based utility for maintenance procedures. And just doing the basic straightening, the rough straightening on this guard. It seems to have gotten really squished right where the handguard leaves the shell. And the radius there is extremely tight. But the back end, the little hook that goes into the pommel, isn't really all that bad. So I'm just going to straighten it here. The blue tape is to protect the soft brass. Is extremely soft at this point, having been annealed. So the blue tape is just to protect that soft brass from any burrs or even light rust on this stake would imprint itself into the brass. Wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing in this case because there's a lot of texture on the brass, but just so used to putting it on there. Oh, there's one little spot right where that hand guard leaves the shell guard. You can see about an inch up there. It's actually swedged outward. So I forged that. I had to forge that down a little bit thinner, and then I want to twist. I want to carefully twist each section. But again, if I grab it in the vise, it will leave the imprint of the jaws on the piece. So I went and got some copper sheet and annealed it. You can see I had annealed this previously. And then just open it up, make some little soft copper jaw protectors. I never had a pair for this vise. And then the little crescent wrench that I keep in my pocket, I occasionally hone that thing smooth and have taken the corners off of it. It's actually been filed a little more open so that it'll fit a larger nut than it really was intended to. And when I do that, I make sure they're clean and polished and file the edges off. If they get scarred up, I keep them clean just for this reason, so they give me a non-marring twisting wrench. Here I'm just pressing out some of the worst damage in that shell guard. What you can't really see in the pictures here is that the top one there has a rip in it that extends from the back almost halfway down the boss there. It's a crack, a rip at the back, and then a crack as it goes into that shell guard. And I don't want to solder that because it's a very red brass. And I could, boy, I could spend some time color matching it, but then you have flow problems if you're, if that's a lower melting temperature than the solder, and you can always see the solder. So what I'm hoping to do is just to keep it annealed and move it back without furthering that crack, and just kind of chase up the area so that you can't notice it. That's the plan anyway. Now I've got to open this, and that crack unfortunately goes right across the base of this. So I'm going to look for a form to do the bending. I don't want to try to freehand bend this without support, because underneath that...
all right, so I found a die
underneath that
for
is a big crack.
Different style of bender, a Hausfeld style bender, and this die seems to fit the that interior radius pretty well. So what I did, I turned up an adapter so that I can fit this die onto the diacro style bender, and we'll see if that does it.
So with it supported in this diacro bender, I just made up a little adapter there. I actually had turned that adapter earlier to allow me to fit these Hausfeld style dies onto the diacro bender. And with it supported, looks like I'm getting a pretty good bend, but I want to make sure that the radius is right. So I'm just going to assemble and quickly measure the distance needed. That hook has to land in the right place. And so there's the little mortise for the hook. And I'm just going to measure from the base of the shell guard, the base of the boss, to the bottom of the hook, and it's about 4.5 inches. So here I'm just kind of bending a little and checking, bending a little and checking. I just want to make sure that it's going to end up at 90 when the bottom of that notch is at 4.5 inches, and the radius was perfect. I don't often get that lucky. So here's a test run. I just want to see, I guess I already revealed that I got lucky, but I just wanted to see that everything would actually go together. And it did quite nicely. Which I have to say I was very relieved, because that crack, when you have a large crack like that, gosh, the more you bend it, the worse it gets. And any force that you put through that area, which is why I wanted to support it with a die, if you put any support through that area, without, you put force through that area without support, and that all of that is concentrated through the area that's not cracked, so it just makes it worse and worse. I didn't want that thing to fall off. But there we have it. Went together quite nicely. The tang isn't all the way in, but that doesn't matter. The geometry of the handle setup is what matters in this case. So now it's just a matter of buffing the guard out and seeing if I can't get somewhere close to the patina. They were a little bit different. The pommel and the guard are red, and the grip is more yellow in color, the brass. So they were a little bit different to begin with. Here, just take some cotton and a hemostat and make a little swab. And that's just plain birchwood KC brass black, by the way. A lot of these things I'll mix up myself, but in that case I had just ordered some. There you can really clearly see that tear that I was worried about on the back where my thumb is. And that tear extends about almost to the center of the hole for the tang. But it exists as a sort of a crotty crack. It's not completely separated there. So I was able to straighten it without making that any worse. And I did leave some indication of the damage in that shell guard. I didn't chase it all out. Just because the rest of the piece is so beat up, I thought it might look a little silly if I make that look brand new. Now, the sharp-eyed among you will notice that I am assembling this backwards, so that if you were to handle this sword, the blade would face you while you held it. And yes, I did in fact completely assemble it that way. I had to take it, I just had to file it back off, take it all back down, and flip the blade around. But that only took a few minutes. You can see a little cup in the end of the tang, and that's from punching it through a third time in order to flip the blade around. Because the tangs are iron, there's a lot of material in there that you can stretch, and if you go back and look at the original shot of the tang, it's all torn up and mushed up. That's how they stretch and adjust them anyway, so it's really not an issue to, you're not removing much material at all when you rivet it up. You could probably do that another 5 or 6 times before it was a real problem. Well, it was a lot of fun. It went back together, and gave me a chance to play around with these old swords. Thanks for watching.